It was only meant to be a simple local history project. In the autumn of 2022, archivist Emma North was helping the County Museum prepare an exhibition of Victorian photographs called Ordinary Lives. A box of glass negatives from a long-closed studio in the market town of Ashfield had recently been donated by the photographer's great-grandson. The plates, wrapped in brittle paper, covered weddings, shop fronts, Sunday school groups, and the usual stiff family portraits that filled late 19th century albums. One plate, thicker than the others, carried a faded label in ink along the edge: Miss C. Reeves, birthday T, March 12, 1886. It sounded promising. Victorian birthday photos were rare outside wealthy families. Most people saved their shillings for weddings and christenings. A birthday group from 1886 might make a nice contrast with the stark studio portraits that dominated the collection. Emma set the plate carefully on the scanner and waited as the machine's light bar crept across the glass. On her monitor, the negative blossomed into a positive image. A parlor appeared, floral wallpaper, a mantel crowded with knickknacks, a lace-draped table in the center. Around the table stood 6 young people. At the head, in front of a large iced cake, was a young woman in a light-colored dress with puffed sleeves. She was maybe 20, perhaps a little younger, her hair pinned up in the style of the day. 5 others clustered around her. 2 other young women in darker dresses and 3 young men in suits, stiff collars catching the light. They were all looking at the camera. Not exactly smiling, Victorians rarely did in photographs, but with an air of being pleased at the occasion. One of the men held a glass. Another leaned one elbow on the back of a chair with affected nonchalance. At the center of the table, the cake sat on a stand. 2 tiers, carefully iced, with 5 large candles pushed into the top and 1 into the side, perhaps an in-joke about the host's age. Emma zoomed in to check focus. The details sharpened. The pattern of the tablecloth, the serrated edge of the cake knife, the faint sheen on the birthday girl's dress where it caught the light from the window. In the background, on the left, she noticed a half-open doorway and the suggestion of another figure, a woman's silhouette, half obscured by the doorframe. It was a good, clear photograph. She made notes for the catalog. Indoor group, 6 young adults, birthday cake visible, parlor interior. She was about to move on when she glanced back at the label in the database and frowned. The studio daybook that came with the negatives listed the job in neat handwriting. March 12, 1886. Miss Clara Reeves, birthday party at 3 p.m., house on Mill Street. Group of friends, 6 plates, 1 selected. Underneath, in another hand, someone had added later in pencil, all dead by morning. Emma stared at the line. All dead by morning. At first she thought it was some kind of dark joke by the old photographer. Then, as she looked back at the young faces gathered around the cake, the words took on a different weight. 6 people. 1 photograph. A note that suggested none of them would live to see the next day's light. She checked the original label again. There was no hint of tragedy in the way it had been written. Birthday T, nothing more. But that penciled line in the ledger nagged at her. She opened the county's digitized newspaper archive and searched for March 1886, Ashfield, death, Mill Street. The headline that came up made her skin prickle. Fatal birthday party, 5 young persons poisoned, shocking affair at Ashfield. Now the photograph on her screen looked different. The cake in the center of the table no longer seemed festive. The pale faces around it, the glasses, the cut slices, they all looked like evidence. The report explained what the ledger's 4 words had only hinted at. On the evening of March 12, 1886, 5 young people who had attended a birthday tea at the house of Mr. and Mrs. Josiah Reeves on Mill Street had died within hours of each other, suffering violent vomiting, stomach pain, and collapse. A 6th guest, the birthday girl herself, had survived but been gravely ill. The doctors had quickly suspected poison. Arsenic. Suddenly, the photograph Emma had scanned was no longer just a quaint Victorian scene. It was a record taken, according to the studio book, at 3 o'clock that afternoon, about an hour before the cake was cut. A photograph of 5 people smiling, unaware that the slices in front of them had been laced with poison. And somewhere, at the edge of the frame, half visible in a doorway, the outline of a woman who, the inquest would later suggest, might have known exactly what would happen next. Emma knew then that this image could not simply be filed under Ordinary Lives. It belonged to a different kind of story. She printed a copy of the newspaper article and laid it beside a still from the photograph. Names in the report began to attach themselves to faces in the image. The birthday girl was named as Miss Clara Reeves, turning 21. The guests were listed as Miss Alice Morton, age 20, Miss Lydia Sharp, 19, Mr. William Carter, 22, and brothers John and Edward Finch, 20 and 17. all from respectable local families. All by the time the newspaper went to press in their graves. The report mentioned a sixth person present at the tea, Mrs. Eliza Reeves, Clara's stepmother, who had superintended the refreshments. There was no photograph of Eliza in the paper. But in the photograph from the studio, Emma noticed again that faint figure in the background. A woman's form in a dark dress standing just inside the parlor door, her face turned slightly away as if she'd been caught half in, half out of the room when the shutter clicked. If that was Eliza, then the killer, or at least the person the town had whispered about in that role, was indeed visible in the last happy moment before the poison did its work. The article ended with a note that the coroner had opened an inquest and that the circumstances were of the gravest and most mysterious character. Emma wanted to know what the coroner had found. The county record office held bound volumes of inquest transcripts for that period. A week later, she sat at a long table under buzzing strip lights, the faint smell of old paper and dust in the air, and opened the leather-bound volume for 1886. The entry for the Ashfield birthday poisonings ran for dozens of pages. On the first day of the inquest, held in the back room of the Crown and Anchor public house, the coroner, Mr. Ellison, had called witnesses to establish the basic facts. Dr. Henry Cobb, who had been summoned to the Reeves house on the night of March 12th, described arriving to find 5 young people on makeshift beds and couches in the parlor and hallway. They were, without exception, suffering from violent retching and purging, his statement read. The extremities were cold, the features pinched, the pupils somewhat contracted. There was intense pain complained of in the abdomen. The symptoms were those I have more than once observed in cases of arsenical poisoning. Despite administration of emetics and other remedies, all 5 died between midnight and 4 in the morning. Miss Reeves, the host, had been ill as well but recovered. The coroner asked where she had been seated at the table. In the center by the cake, the doctor replied. She is the young lady who appears in the Harcourt photograph. It seemed the studio proprietor, summoned by the police the day after the deaths, had already handed over a print of the image as evidence. The inquest transcript referred to it simply as the photograph. Emma imagined the coroner holding up that same image she had on her screen, showing the jury the unsuspecting faces around the cake. The next witness was Mr. Josiah Reeves, Clara's father. He testified that his first wife, Clara's mother, had died when Clara was an infant. He had remarried some years later to Eliza, the woman now running the household. On the day of the party, he said, he had been at the mill until late and had not joined the tea. He only came home after his daughter and her friends had already been taken ill. When asked about the cake, he said he believed it had been baked by his wife with flour from their own bin and purchased sugar and eggs. He had seen nothing amiss. Then came the testimony of Clara herself. The transcript noted that she was pale and much affected, and that her answers were given in a low voice. She described how her friends had arrived around 2:30, Alice and Lydia together, the Finch brothers shortly after, and William last. Her stepmother had set out tea, bread and butter, jam, a few boiled eggs, and the cake that had been iced that morning. The photographer, Mr. Harcourt, had been engaged several days before to come at 3 o'clock. We stood around the table, Clara said. Mrs. Reeves stood in the doorway. She said she did not wish to be in the picture. After the photograph they sat down. Her stepmother sliced the cake and served each guest a generous portion. Did you yourself eat of the cake? The coroner asked. Only a small piece, Clara replied. I was too excited to eat and thought I would have some later. What of your stepmother? She did not take any. She said she had no taste for sweets. Clara added that she had not thought it odd at the time. Eliza often claimed to be watching her figure. Within 2 hours the first symptoms appeared. Lydia complained of feeling hot and dizzy. William clutched his stomach. Soon all 5 guests were violently ill. Clara began to feel sick too, though less severely. Mrs. Reeves, according to Clara, fussed over them, sent for the doctor, wrung her hands in distress. At this point in the testimony, the coroner began to circle around motive. Had there been quarrels in the house? Any recent purchases of rat poison? Any insurance policies? Josiah admitted that he had taken out small life insurance policies on his daughter and 2 of the guests who were also his apprentices, a common practice at the time, meant to cover funeral expenses. He insisted that the sums were modest. The local chemist testified that Mrs. Reeves had indeed purchased arsenic a fortnight earlier, for the destruction of beetles. That too was not uncommon. Arsenic-based insect powders and rat poisons were readily sold over the counter. The problem was opportunity. Several people had access to the kitchen. The flour and sugar bins were open. The cake had been iced on the parlor table where, theoretically, anyone could have tampered with it. The most damning testimony came from one of the household maids, a nervous girl of 16 named Mary Price. She stated that on the morning of the party she had seen her mistress, Mrs. Reeves, standing at the pantry shelf with the arsenic tin open. She was stirring something white in a cup, Mary said. When she saw me she started and told me to go and fetch wood. Did you see her put the contents of the cup into the cake batter? The coroner asked. Mary hesitated. I cannot say as I saw it go into the batter, sir. Only that she had the cup in the poison tin, and later the cup was by the bowl. The defense, for by then Mrs. Reeves had engaged a solicitor, seized on that uncertainty. Younger maids, he suggested, were prone to imagination. The arsenic might well have been used as stated for beetles. The poison could have been introduced after the cake left the kitchen by any number of people. Perhaps, he hinted darkly, one of the guests had enemies of their own. In the end, the inquest jury returned an open verdict. Death by arsenical poisoning, but by whom administered there is no evidence to show. No one was charged. Eliza Reeves left Ashfield within the year, according to the electoral rolls. Clara went to live with an aunt in another town. There the trail in the official record grew faint. For Emma, reading the transcript, the frustration of the coroner was almost palpable. All the physical signs pointed to deliberate poisoning. The timing, all 5 guests sick within hours of eating the cake, was too precise to be accident. But Victorian law required more than suspicion. She went back to the photograph. Zoomed in on the blurred figure in the doorway. The image, though grainy, showed a woman in a dark dress, her hands clasped together at her waist. Her face was turned just away from the camera. If that was Eliza, the woman who chose not to sit at the table, who claimed no taste for sweets, who possibly, but not provably, stirred arsenic into the batter, then the killer in this case had, indeed, stepped into the frame. There was one more avenue to explore: family memory. The names of the victims, Morton, Sharp, Carter, Finch, were still present in Ashfield's registers. Some of their kin might have kept stories about the birthday poisoning. Through the museum's local history society, Emma was put in touch with an elderly man named Peter Finch, who had spent years assembling his family tree. Over tea in his front room, surrounded by framed photographs of ancestors, he nodded when she mentioned March 1886. "Oh, he said. That was our John and Edward. My grandfather's brothers. We were always told they died at a birthday party. My gran used to say, it's a mercy there weren't more of them in that room. She never much cared for the Reeves woman." He had, in a folder, a yellowed copy of the same newspaper article Emma had found, and a handwritten note from his grandmother on the back. Always she said it was the stepmother, he went on. Reeves' second wife. They could never prove it. But folk didn't forget. When Emma showed him the digital image of the photograph, he leaned forward and peered at it through his spectacles. "That'll be John," he said, tapping the figure of the young man with an elbow on the chair. "And Edward there with the glass. Look how young they are." His voice caught for a moment. "And that shadow in the doorway?" Emma asked gently. He squinted. "Hard to say," he replied slowly. "But if that's not Mrs. Reeves, I'd be surprised. She always was one to hover and listen by all accounts." Through parish records, Emma traced what became of Clara. She married in 1890, 4 years after the tragedy, to a clerk named Arthur Mills. The marriage register, in the space for father's name and occupation, still listed Josiah Reeves, mill hand. No mention of the stepmother who had raised her. She had 2 sons and a daughter. The 1911 census showed her living in another town, a draper's wife, children, 3, all living. There was no direct evidence in the forms that she ever told them about the day their mother and father's parlor filled with dying guests. But in the margin of one letter preserved in a box of family papers, donated by a distant cousin to the archive decades later, there was a throwaway line from her eldest son to his sister. "Mother is in her black mood again," he wrote in 1923. "She says she cannot abide birthdays and would we please not make a fuss of hers." Emma thought of that when she looked once more at the photograph. There was something almost defiant in the way Clara stood at the head of the table, hands planted lightly on the edge, shoulders squared. To her right and left, her friends leaned in, each captured at the last moment before their lives turned. The candles on the cake were still unlit. The surface of the icing was smooth, hiding whatever lay inside. The 5 guests looked like any group of young people on the cusp of adulthood, happy to be together on a late winter afternoon. Within hours they would be retching, crying out, collapsing onto hastily made beds. Within a day their bodies would be in coffins. The photograph, sitting for decades in a box in an attic, had seen none of that, yet held all of it in potential. When Emma proposed including the image and its story in an exhibition of last portraits, there was some hesitation at the museum. The Holocaust images, the Victorian postmortem child portraits, those already carried an official weight of tragedy. This, by comparison, was a small local event. But that was precisely what drew her to it. It showed how, even far from battlefields and famous disasters, an ordinary parlor on an ordinary street could become the stage for something just as final. The caption she wrote for the display avoided sensationalism. Birthday group at the house of Josiah and Eliza Reeves, Ashfield, March 12, 1886. Photograph taken approximately 1 hour before 5 of the 6 young people pictured fell ill and died from arsenic poisoning after eating birthday cake. The case was never solved. The woman in the doorway is believed to be the hostess, Mrs. Reeves, who did not eat the cake. Visitors to the exhibition would stop, read, and then look more closely at the faces. Some muttered. Some shook their heads. A few walked away quickly. One woman, perhaps in her 30s, stood for a long time in front of the enlarged print, her own small child fidgeting beside her. "It's the ordinariness that gets you," she said half to Emma, who was standing nearby. "They look like they should all be going dancing after this. Not to the grave." History, in the case of the Reeves birthday, never provided the neat closure of a conviction, a confession, a clearly named villain. Eliza lived out her life in another county under her married name, dying in 1909 of what the death register blandly called heart disease. If she had murdered those 5 young people, she never admitted it to any clerk or coroner. Clara, carrying the double weight of survivor's guilt and suspicion about her stepmother, built a life anyway. Husband, children, letters in which birthdays were treated as something to be endured rather than celebrated. The Finch, Morton, Sharp, and Carter families buried sons and daughters and told stories about arsenic and cakes to their grandchildren, who turned them into half-remembered tales of the cursed party or the bad aunt. And in a box in a studio storeroom, the glass plate of that afternoon sat until time and chance brought it to light again. A photograph is, in the end, just reflected light fixed in chemistry. But sometimes, as Emma knew when she looked at that ash-smelling parlor frozen in 1886, it is also a trapdoor. On one side, an hour in which nothing terrible has yet happened. On the other, all the knowledge we bring to it now, the newspaper headline, the inquest testimony, the genealogical notes, the whispered accusations. The people in the frame cannot see what we see. That is what makes such images so powerful and so hard to look at. The 5 guests at Clara's birthday party smiled as much as customs allowed, straightened their jackets, smoothed their skirts, and fixed their eyes on Mr. Harcourt's camera, thinking of the nice card that would result. They did not know their names would be printed days later under the words "fatal poisoning." They did not know that a century later, strangers would stand in a museum and peer into their faces, trying to guess, from the tilt of a head or the set of a jaw, which of them laughed the most, which of them was first to feel the cramp in the stomach, which of them suspected, too late, that something in the cake tasted odd. We will never know with certainty who stirred the arsenic into the batter, or whether the shadow in the parlor doorway cherished private satisfaction or only fear. What we do know is that at 3 o'clock on a March afternoon in 1886, a shutter snapped, light etched itself onto glass, and 6 young lives were caught at the exact moment before a choice someone else had made for them took effect. That thin slice between ignorance and knowledge is where this story lives. And it is why, more than 100 years later, we still find ourselves drawn to that crowded little parlor, to a cake we know is deadly, and to a cluster of faces that had no idea.